Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel session where we'll discuss important issues surrounding California's policy arena to advance the state's offshore wind industry. I just want to give another shout out to Assemblymember Briggs Burr. With champions like him in the legislature, we're going to be all right, okay? We just got to get through this. We're going to be all right. So my name is Brian White, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for this esteemed panel, which will help us set the stage for the rest of the conference. As the announcement stated, I am a partner at KP Public Affairs. We have actually served as Offshore Wind California's primary legislative advocate for the last 5 years. I'm both on the regulatory side. So there's been a lot of thorny issues, and I've been blessed to work with this industry, and now I get to talk about some of these issues with this esteemed panel. We are standing at a pivotal moment in California's energy policy, and particularly for offshore wind industry. You know, I'm thinking about back to AB 525, which many of us worked on, in 2021, and it was interesting because Assemblymember David Chu, who was the author of that bill, no one thought offshore wind was really an actual thing in California. It was kind of a unicorn, and we actually got that bill passed, bipartisan support, and it was to the leadership of the administration, Newsom administration, that we got that bill signed. So here we are now, 5 years later, and there's been a strategic plan, and in 2024. California Energy Commission adopted a strategic plan, and these two bills, both the strategic plan and the AB 525, were linchpins in getting this industry started in California. But since that time, there's been other things. I mean, we haven't just been sitting on our laurels. We've been doing other bills. Senator Briggs Burr mentioned AB 3. We also had essential procurement legislation that the administration helped sponsor, and then there's been other bills, which some of our panelists will talk about in just a second. But the most historic one, of course, was the enactment and the voters' approval of Prop 4, which was $450 million for port upgrades. That pretty much is the catalyst to get these ports developed. Without funding for ports, this industry is not going to happen in California. We know that. That's why we're here today in Long Beach, and of course our partners in Humboldt as well. So, is everything rosy? No, we know that. Even with these victories, there are challenges that lie ahead. Clearly, we're not going to meet the 2030 goal for 5 gigawatts. But to get us in the ballpark, the state will need to overcome some of these challenges. And those include permitting, transmission. We also have workforce development issues. We have issues to deal with tribal and community impacts, environmental impacts. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and we can do those without the federal government at this time. But if you couple this with the growing concerns about energy affordability, because that is a real thing, people are really paying attention to these issues, and some members of Burr talked about AI and data centers. Those are also growing issues that the state legislature is trying to rest with, but we can actually be a potential solution to that issue if we fix our issues that we need to address in some of these policies. So we're going to get into that. We're not going to spend time with the whole narrative about federal versus state. Those issues are going to play out by themselves, and I think there's a panel to discuss that. But the questions are really not so much about why and who of controlling certain policies. Really, it's about what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it, and how soon are we going to do it. So the stakes are high. We're going to get into these discussions, but first we'll start with some introductions for our panelists, and I'll start with Molly Croll, who's the Senior Policy Director for American Clean Power. So Molly?
I'm just introducing myself?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Offshore Wind California. It's great to be here. As others have said, great to be in a room full of offshore wind supporters and believers. I'm Molly Croll. I'm the Senior Policy Director with American Clean Power California. I cover a range of regulatory policy and market issues for our members, including our offshore wind members, and I've been working on offshore wind for the last 7 years in a number of capacities.
Rick?
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Rick Umoff. I'm with Vineyard Offshore. I lead the development of our lease area off the north coast of Humboldt, California. Vineyard Offshore is a leading U.S. offshore wind developer. We have just completed a project off the coast of Massachusetts, Vineyard Wind, which was the first utility-scale offshore wind project constructed in the United States. About 800 megawatts, will power about 400,000 homes. Our project off the coast of Humboldt will be closer to 2 gigawatts. able to power something around 1 million homes. We are very focused on early outreach, tribal outreach, community outreach, working with labor partners, and really thinking about the many co-benefits that the offshore wind industry and offshore wind projects can deliver. Thanks.
Great. Eddie on?
Good morning, Eddie On, Executive Director of Brightline. Some of you are familiar with other Brightline staff work as well. We'll have a policy advisor, Astrid Dubois, talking about some of our legal work on offshore wind, on trying to make sure that this industry still survives. But in case you don't know about Brightline, essentially we have two teams that do very different things. Direct services, the act of providing services directly to the community. My own kind of nostalgia around serving, for instance, the North Coast with a barbecue, for instance, is a great example of what Brightline can do in stitching together community and making sure that this policy is ultimately relevant to localities that are impacted by offshore wind. And the second component is really our policy work, so stitching together local community perspectives, meeting communities on their own terms. It's literally thousands of hours of investment and relationships, travel up and down the coast to understand offshore wind and how it can benefit everyone. So with that, I'll pass it over to Eli.
Thank you, Eddie. Eli, please.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Brian, and thanks Offshore Wind California, Alejandra, and Adam. Another great event. Cool to be in the third city that this event has happened in since it started. So thanks again for having us. My name is Eli Harland. I work at the California Energy Commission. Won't give you a big background on what the commission does and works on. I think everybody got to sit through the chair's keynote earlier and hear those, but I work in our Siting, Transmission, and Environmental Protection Division. So this is the group at the CEC that licenses power plants in the state. And we also have a small group. There's about 5 of us who work on more of the long-range planning. So not the licensing of power plants, but the planning for future resources. So the team that I supervise works in the marine energy environment, coastal environment. The work that we're responsible for doing is implementing a lot of statutes or laws that have already been put on the books. So Assembly Bill 3, which you just heard about, our team is implementing that bill. We're also implementing Proposition 4. We heard a bit about that from Brian a bit ago. And we also are managing grants with the Port of Long Beach, Port of Humboldt, soon to be managing grants with Richmond, with the Port of Oakland, and Port St. Louis. And so our team is here today. They can raise their hands, or you'll find them around the building if you want to chat to them about their programs.
Thank you, Eli. And that's actually a good segue, because our first couple of questions we're going to get into, there's like this kitchen soup of all these bills that have been passed, right? And first, I want to give it up to the CEC and the Newsom administration they're at the center of the universe right now in terms of a lot of energy policy. So I just want to give them a round of applause real quick, because they've done a great job. Can you provide us with a status of where the implementation, there's milestones, there's timelines. You mentioned AB 525, there's AB 3, AB 209, and now, of course, Prop 4 funding, which was in AB 105. What's going on?
Yeah, those are good ones. Okay, so AB 3 broadly calls on the CEC to prepare a second phase seaport strategy that builds off of the seaport analysis that was done in AB 525. AB 3 also is asking the CEC to prepare a report on supply chain and workforce strategies for offshore wind. That report is constrained by statute to have a pretty high in-state supply analysis, so looking at the supply chain and analyzing the ability of the state to meet a large portion of that. So currently, that first report that I mentioned, the CEC has had public process over the last year. We've had a number of workshops, and we're currently in the process of drafting that first report. We anticipate around mid-summer or so, we'll have a release of that report as well as a public workshop. So again, the focus of that is seaport readiness. And I'll kind of give you a glimpse of what will be covered in that report. A lot of it is pulling information together that was developed through AB 525 and presenting it in a way that meets the statutory requirement or the way we're being asked to look at that. And then there are also some new areas that were in AB 3 that build off of AB 525. And I think some of the things to highlight are we're being asked to look at and evaluate the possible cost of upgrading ports for all the different functions a port would have to be required to do. And part of that, we're also looking at the financing strategies behind that. So as we sort of looked around at the available literature and what people had produced leading up to the development of our report, there isn't a lot out there on financial models or how ports would, recover their cost after being developed. And so in our report, we want to put it out there for public review and public consumption and get everybody's reactions. But what you'll see are some new ideas around how financing can work, who pays, who benefits, like those kind of pieces we're really trying to unpack in that report. So that's AB 209, that's AB 3. AB 209 you mentioned, Brian, I think I kind of summarized that alongside with Prop 4. So Prop 4, as you mentioned, $475 million authorized by the voters in California. About half of that has now been appropriated by the legislature. That was last year. As part of that appropriation to the CEC, the legislature allowed us to use some of those funds for some existing grants that we had done through, like Brian mentioned, what's called AB 209, and that's what we call the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program. Currently we are pretty much have executed most of those grant agreements for the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program. And for the remaining Prop 4 funds that have not been awarded, we have done one public workshop to basically introduce the public to the statutes and the requirements, some of the early considerations that the CEC is making around those. And then we opened up for public comment. So actually, mark it down. This Friday is when our public comment period closes. So I do apologize for picking that out on a week where everybody's at a conference, but we do appreciate the comments. This is I think as Brian said, it's an important program. It's a high stakes program. It is a program you don't get to keep doing over and over again. It's gonna be a program that has to happen the right way when it's implemented. So the next step you'll see is after those comments close, we will have a public review process on a draft of a solicitation. That is, I wouldn't say that's unique. CEC does that sometimes, but we don't always put out a draft of something that we're gonna then competitively bid on later. But we see that as a really important step here, rather than kind of coming out and saying, hey, we think we got it right, and then find out we didn't and have to take things back. So I think that kind of covers where we're at with the funding parts.
That is a great summary, and now I'm going to ask the industry. How are you guys feeling about these timelines? Do we need to expedite some of these timelines? Do we need to change anything, both either legislatively, regulatory? Like, how is the offshore wind industry thinking? Molly, you first.
Yeah, well, I think just sort of to take us back at a little bit higher level, 2022 to 2024 was felt like an all-out sprint for the offshore wind industry, right? Like we were designing new policies, getting them implemented, working cross-agency, getting AB 525 established with the CEC, and it was sort of like every 6 months we had another thing. We're like, hey, state, we also need help with this. We're special for this reason. We need assistance with this and that. Now I think we're kind of more into a phase of we just need consistency. And California has been really tremendous in its consistent support for the offshore wind industry, and that's kind of where we're at right now, is the consistency. On top of that, it's building in a little bit of flexibility, and those may seem like two different opposing words, but it's true. I mean, we need the consistent signals of where we're trying to go, consistent implementation of the programs that the state has already developed, and then also flexibility to understand, yeah, timelines have shifted a little bit, and if you want me to talk specifically transmission or anything, I can.
We'll get to that in
Yeah,
a second.
okay.
Hold your powder for that.
Sure.
So from an actual developer, Rick, I know you guys are looking at this both from, there's opportunities, there's investors, there's all these things going around, and all the timelines. And we know we have typography in California that is not the same as the ones in East Coast or even in other parts of the world where there is floating offshore wind technology. I was wondering if you can kind of explain, like, what can California policymakers and lawmakers learn from the experiences you're already doing with floating offshore wind technology? And are there any efforts that Vineyard is working on to prove that technology can be done at scale?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first I want to just kind of echo the sentiments of sort of acknowledging the consistent role the state has played, providing strong signals to this industry. That can't be overstated, the importance of that, as well as a great coalition of partners, including Port of Long Beach here for hosting us this conference. Our trade groups, Offshore Wind California, and ACP, and a number of folks who have really been part of a coalition that's been driving this. This is definitely a team effort, and I want to acknowledge that. I think this is a place where California, which has so long been a leader in clean energy, as you heard from the chair's comments earlier this morning, is going to benefit from learnings and cost curves coming down and innovation globally. Our investment partner, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, is involved in offshore wind development around the globe, including floating offshore wind. And we recently announced a contract for a project in Panelists, Scotland, which will be a floating offshore wind project that will help to start to scale this technology that will serve about 70,000 homes. Similarly, we just bid into a recent auction in Korea for two several hundred megawatt size projects, also floating. So this is happening globally, and California is going to reap the benefits of the learnings and of the costs coming down in these other markets and bringing that here. And what's really important now in this early stage is continuing to implement this policy framework that's laid out in AB 525, a lot of the proceedings that Eli referenced, and doing so in a coordinated fashion. There are a lot of tendrils to offshore wind right now in the policy landscape. It's easy to kind of get lost in those. And to the extent that procurement, transmission, port development, and a lot of related sort of sub areas can be developed in tandem in a coordinated fashion, that's going to provide the foundation for the technology when it kind of arrives on California's shores.
Great, thank you, Rick. So let's talk a little bit more about the human side of this industry, because we know there are benefits, there's opportunities, there's challenges. But Eddie, this question is for you. Obviously, there's potential here, and we do eventually want to get cleaner energy online. But I wanted to get your perspective, recognizing there could be some potential environmental impacts and things on the communities. And you have sponsored legislation in the past to deal with some of these issues. I wonder if you can give us a sense of how that legislation is playing out, and you can talk about the bill number and things that you're trying to do to make sure that there's community benefits in all this process.
Wanted to pick up on a thread around consistency, which I've been very appreciative of Vineyard's efforts to really hold solid in an era where developers seem to be cutting side deals and going squiggly on what we all know is like a long construction time frame. But I still believe it's very much full steam ahead. And our team at Brightline has been really working through all the legislative processes that Eli's talked about, whether it's capacity building funds, for instance, in AB 3, AB 1417, which was originally authored by Assemblymember Addis, and then Assemblymember Stephanie carried it out to its conclusion, which was really focused on transparency around community benefits agreements. But I would say the way to think about community benefits agreements, also known by the acronym CBAs, is that it's very much a tool to engage communities, to leverage, hopefully, things like a capacity building fund to get at, ultimately, how does this benefit a local community in a way that they see fit? And also minimize, perhaps, if not avoid entirely, the environmental impacts that can come from industrializing the ocean space to, creating these large manufacturing facilities, et cetera. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth. I would say more broadly, my mind is jumping to the national level conversation again to return to this theme of inconsistency nowadays. Like, it's such a tumultuous environment. Even later today, I'm planning to go to DC to essentially become a witness around the judgment fund and what's happening around offshore wind leases right now. These are very difficult conversations to have, but the way I look at this is like, if there is no clean energy project to discuss, if it's all, destroyed essentially by, larger moves that are happening, whether at the state or federal level, what's the point of sitting around and talking about these projects? Like, I'd much rather us be on a very consistent pathway to get there, and then work along the equity, environmental justice concerns that Brightline has always been a leader on.
Good. Rick, any response to those comments? Because as a developer, you guys are working hand in hand with communities.
I mean, I really appreciate Eddie's comments there, and also want to acknowledge Brightline's role as a leader in the space from very early days, and really, frankly, kind of pushing the industry, to really be thinking community first. And one thing that we have done we've established in partnership with NCIDC, a nonprofit based on the North Coast, a tribal capacity fund that North Coast-based tribal nations can access to better sort of participate and engage with the project development process. We recognize that this is a long-term effort, and we recognize that these are big projects that are hard to wrap your arms around, and folks have a lot of demands on their time, their resources, and it's important to be able to have the ability to engage early and often.
Great, thank you. So Ed, if I can just pivot to workforce issues, because I know you're working a little bit on that as well. This is a highly specialized industry, as you know, and there's going to be a lot of need for education, training centers, and so forth. What specific services do you think are needed to ensure local residents will benefit from these jobs that are going to come to these two areas, particularly right now?
Maybe
I can open that up to everybody. So
the other panelists also probably have thoughts on
Yes,
this,
they
but a lot of Brightline's early work was trying to identify who was going to be the local workforce development system, ideally, that this could all tie into. It could be funded under, say, a project labor agreement or a CBA. A lot of it has been, from our observations, centered with the county, for instance, in both the North Coast and even the Central Coast to some degree. So it's not to say there aren't other great local groups doing also work, like to shout out Seafrog, for instance. I've loved the VR demonstrations that they've done around offshore wind and tying it particularly with the local building trades, and trying to make sure that there's an envisioning of what even a construction site looks like, because it's still so far off in people's minds. So that kind of work is, it's stuff we need to replicate ideally, and just ideally rally communities around this idea that they should share in these projects as well, and its economic development.
Eli, I know you guys are working on this as part of the AB3 process.
Yeah, we are, and I think like building on, you started at AB 525, and I think that was really a place where at least the sort of the list of skills, the requirements was kind of developed first. And so building from that in AB3, we haven't gotten into a lot of the labor and workforce sides within our Seaport Readiness Report. We've kind of, we've kind of drawn a line that said like, hey, Seaport Readiness, let's talk about the labor and the workforce that's required to develop those ports, and look at that and see if there's any recommendations we might make or next steps. But then in the second report that we have to develop for AB3, that's the supply chain and workforce report. That's going to have a really strong component and focus on workforce. So that's a report that's not due until the end of 2027. So we've gotten started on scoping, but we haven't gotten started on that public process. But that's where I expect us to get into those conversations for sure.
Excellent. All right, let's switch to this easy issue called transmission and permitting. Molly, you're well known in the industry as a very well known expert about these issues. So I want to get your take on the issue that CPUC, California Public Utilities Commission, and CAISO have been addressing with respect to offshore wind. We know there's potential bottlenecks and readiness, but what is the status of some of these proceedings, and what's the impact that it could have on offshore wind if it's not done right?
Yeah, sure. So offshore wind, in transmission planning, we tend to talk about location-constrained resources. Offshore wind is like the pinnacle example of that. There's only small areas that offshore wind could be developed as designated by the federal government at least. So you can't live with a system where you're just asked, find the areas with existing capacity. You need to be doing proactive transmission development to the resource location. The upside of that is you get access to scale, a lot of high quality megawatts and megawatt hours from a single location. So in 2023, well, I guess it was the beginning of 2024, the CAISO approved a major 500 kV system to connect Humboldt offshore wind to the Bay Area, which would be the load center. Hugely important, major upgrade, I think one of the biggest upgrades the CAISO had approved in years. And then later, the CAISO, through its interconnection process enhancements, developed a system where it could reserve deliverability for certain long lead time resources. Deliverability being what you need to ensure that your resource is deliverable to load when it's performing, so that it can provide what we call resource adequacy capacity. Also hugely important for long lead time resources like offshore wind and others. So those are really foundational, especially given that transmission is going to take a long time to develop. That's a huge system that Vineyard, who was awarded the project, will be developing. And offshore wind takes a long time to develop. So we're trying to align those timelines and make sure the resource is available for offshore wind when offshore wind comes online. Most recently, the PUC developed a set of portfolios for the next transmission plan, so the one that'll be 26 to 27, and adjusted the portfolios a little bit. So offshore wind from Humboldt and the Central Coast, but a little more from Humboldt, is planned to come online a little later, a few years later than it had in the past. And at first, I think developers looked at that and thought, oh my gosh, it's a delay. This is the California expecting less from offshore wind. But I think what we came to realize in the way that the PUC ultimately wrote the decision and the way that the CAISO understands it is going back to the theme I brought up in the beginning about flexibility. So it's really giving the system room to adapt to changing conditions that we know are there given the federal uncertainties. Yeah, I think that's probably good for.
Yeah, and maybe if I can bring you in, Eli, because there's all these other alphabet soup agencies. I mean, you have GoBiz, you have State Lands Commission, SOC, Coastal Commission. How is the permitting coordination going on with those agencies? I know there was legislation to try and deal with some of those issues, but is CEC involved in any of that?
Not to a great extent. I mean, the AB 525 strategic plan had to have, as part of it, was required to have a permitting roadmap. I think what that permitting roadmap did was acknowledge just what you said, the coordination has to occur, right? So that's what's there. CEC's not in directly leading, though, any work around like a new permit paradigm or anything like that. I think we kind of stay at the center. I will acknowledge, and I think you'll hear more about it later, Coastal Commission this year did finish their fisheries working group recommendations and strategy, it doesn't say this is a permit on the front. I know this is for permitting, but that's what it's there for, is to start bringing people in that conversation around the table and start kind of hashing out those issues earlier. So.
Yeah, and if
Yeah,
you
Brett,
just,
could you-
yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in because that's something we haven't touched on as much as the fishing community here, and also a very important community that we work with in the offshore wind space. And I want to just kind of acknowledge the work the Coastal Commission did to establish this or develop this strategic fisheries offshore wind sort of framework that will really be a strong foundation for us to work with the fishing community going forward. This was an intensive 2-year process that the offshore wind leaseholders engaged with fishing community representatives as well as the state, and it ultimately resulted in a really great work product. And that's really a credit to the staff of the Coastal Commission and their leadership there.
Another one that I'll mention, again, sort of in the vein of permitting, but not quite permitting, because it's not, really about conducting surveys and preparing permits at this time, but the work that the Ocean Protection Council has been doing, first in commissioning an offshore wind monitoring guidelines effort, and then now starting to set up its West Coast Science Collaborative. And I know there's a panel about this, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but the idea there is to organize around some baseline research and science that will benefit stakeholders, environmental groups, and the offshore wind industry together. So even though it feels like this is kind of a time of slowing down, there's a lot that's going on kind of under the surface that it's sort of taking advantage of a little bit of luxury of time to set up really valuable frameworks that will help us get ahead when it's kind of more back to the let's go period.
Eddie, any comments from the EJ community about the process of how things are going?
On transmission in particular,
Yes.
I think there are broader policy pieces that Brightline staff have been tracking, like transmission financing, even regionalization, what it means. I mean, the larger vision maybe to emphasize around offshore wind, the hope for it was a utility scale clean energy source that can ultimately retire peaker power plants, which depending on your perspective, you know, may or may not be a good thing, but from our perspective clearly is, because they're rooted primarily in so-called disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities that normally don't have a say in how fossil fuel power plants are sited to begin with. So in an ideal world, this is all integrated as, you know, you have the utility scale clean energy source, whether it's solar, offshore wind, or more, and then ultimately tie in the transmission well enough so you're not building stuff willy-nilly in an inefficient, ineffective manner, and then perhaps more to the point, like inviting land use conflicts that constantly then create a lot of stress for everybody involved. Like nobody wants to necessarily live near a transmission grid, and nowhere I've seen that more in, say, Morro Bay, which has been like a locus for a lot of, you know, anxiety, stress, fear around that. So if there's a way to build this stuff so it doesn't feel wasteful, I think that would be a good way to start.
I'm glad you brought up the regionalization issue. I know that was an issue that you worked on, Molly, and you know, for those of you who don't know, last year there was legislation that created this new regional entity that California will be able to expand its regional markets into energy. It'll help save ratepayer costs. We can sell our energy at times when it's needed, and we can get energy from other states when we need it. So Molly, just really quickly, if you want to get a commercial on what's going on with that process?
Yeah, so I think it was earlier this month, the CAISO officially launched EDAM, the Extended Day Ahead Market, so linking up with the Pacific Corp system. You know, ACP is a huge supporter of regionalization. Bring it back to the conversation at hand. I was at a conference last week that was Western regulators and markets folks, essentially, and talking about the evolution of both EDAM and then a market in the Southwest Power Pool. And the picture that one of the entities presented was all across the West, there's rising demand, not just California, all across the West, some places even much higher than ours, and fossil retirements. And the combination means we need a lot more resources. And they found that even if we have all of the planned resources that are expected to come online, coming online on time and as expected, they're still expecting reliability gaps starting as early as 2035. So the need to plan for large-scale resources under long-term contract is growing, not decreasing, even though there's a market. I mean, markets will help with efficiencies. They help in the sort of inter-hour and inter-day things that you don't know are coming, but the fundamentals of developing new clean energy under long-term contracts still stands. And in fact, you're seeing, you know, resource adequacy programs emerging around the West that are getting more strict, even, you know, asking for resources to sort of lock in even tighter. So all of that, I think, is very relevant to the need for offshore wind. I mean, California is going to need to be building a lot of clean energy for itself under long-term contract. And all of the issues that Chair Hochschild talked about the transition to 100% clean energy and offshore wind being a part of it. We are a part of that. So all of the broader clean energy dynamics of the West are important to us, and that's sort of part of the broader signals of we need new supply that performs all the different hours of the day that makes offshore wind still a very valuable prospect.
All right, we're getting closer to our time here, but I have a couple of rapid-fire questions that you guys don't know about these. So these are just really kind of short answers. So Eli, we'll start with you. So in one sentence, what is the single biggest win CEC hopes to achieve with the first round of Prop 4 appropriations? What's the biggest thing you see coming out of that?
I would say that we successfully build off of the existing grants we have. And at the end of those projects, we've brought everybody along in the funding process. We haven't just focused on the technical. Community's been brought along. The governments, local governments that are around those places have been brought along. The workers have been brought along. Tribal nations are represented. So I know that's not a sentence, but if I think about the success of that, like the technical aspects will get figured out, but sometimes people are forgotten about in all of those processes. So when we actually put the money out and the rubber hits the road, that we're bringing everyone along who's been participating this entire time.
Okay, I'll let you get by with a kind of a paragraph, but it was close enough. Eddie, can offshore wind be California's first truly equitable industrial revolution?
Yes.
Oh, boom. That's not even a sentence.
Wait, that's a yes or no answer, a yes or no question.
I'm getting actually trained to testify before Congress with yes or no answers.
You've been trained. Yes.
But I think one organization I want to also shout out on the North Coast that I've been really appreciating the work is EPIC, and how they've been looking at offshore wind as both an equitable opportunity, how to create ports in a way that doesn't pollute local surrounding communities. And I think from the broader picture of even whether, again, I need to return to this because I think this conference needs to hear it, will offshore wind exist? And I'm very appreciative to Adam Stern, the California Offshore Wind team, and putting this conference together in the way they do. But I do think we are at an inflection point, whether we need to seriously think about the energy we put into this and whether it's collectively worth all our time, because the attacks are furious. This is not, more broadly, regardless of your feelings on the administration. It's more a question of, again, to return to the theme of consistency, whether we'll even have these conversations in a year's time. So that said, yes, everything that Brightline has done to date has been about being sensitive to local community needs, trying to get it done equitably. And then there's also a larger question of whether we'll have offshore wind. So more to come on that. And as an aside, thank you to all the people, even in this conference, that are supporting me in that effort. It's been a lot.
All right. So you, Molly, your rapid fire question. So if there was one legislative bottleneck that if could be removed today, that would most accelerate project timelines by 2030, what do you think it would be?
I would say appropriate the second half of Prop 4 to the CEC so that the CEC could build those funds into its grant solicitation and award process this cycle, rather than having to duplicate it. The sort of piecemeal of let's do a part of it, and then a few years later another part of it. We heard from the last panel, these are major financial investments. The size of the chunks of money matter.
All right. And finally, Rick, so we didn't talk too much about floating technology, but you guys are on the cutting edge of a lot of these things. So what is the one floating technology milestone that will convince global investors that California is the most bankable opportunity in the world? What do you think it is?
Well, I think your question is kind of, there's a couple things in there. I mean, really what is going to make investors believe that California is bankable is just the continued implementation of this policy framework. And that signal being sent consistently is really what we're looking at. In terms of sort of the technology question, it's really scale and seeing the floating industry starting to scale around the world. It's not really a question of if, it's a question of when. And that is already starting to happen, as I mentioned, with some of our projects and other developers' projects as well. And it's more of a question of, are we going to be one of those markets for this new booming industry?
Thank you. Thank you. So we are just about at time. So we've heard a lot this morning. We've heard about permitting, we've heard about transmission, we've heard about Prop 4, community benefits, and everything that the CEC is doing. We know we need to get the Prop 4 dollars out quickly, and that will be number one priority, I know, for a lot of us. But that doesn't mean we need to rest on our laurels. There's a lot of things that we can do, the state can do in the meantime while we're waiting for that funding, and of course, the federal headwinds. But I want to thank the panelists for answering these questions. I hope you learned something. So please join me in thanking our panelists and giving them a round of applause. Thank you.